Part 1. Eleanor Marsh had spent 77 years being the kind of woman that people described as sharp. Sharp mind, sharp eyes, sharp memory. Her doctor, a kind and unhurried man named Dr. Carroll, who had been treating her for 11 years, told her at every annual appointment that her cognitive function was remarkable for her age, that she had the mental acuity of someone 20 years younger, and that whatever she was doing, she should keep doing it. She did the crossword puzzle every morning in ink, not pencil, because pencil felt like admitting the possibility of being wrong. She read 2 books a month, alternating between history and fiction, because she believed you needed both the truth of the past and the imagination of storytellers to understand the world properly. She remembered birthdays without being reminded, remembered conversations word for word weeks after they had happened, remembered the names of people she had met once at a party 15 years ago. Her memory was not just a faculty, it was a point of pride, a piece of her identity, something she had carried through 7 decades of living and intended to carry through however many more she was given. She lived alone in a modest but well-kept brick house in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The same house she had shared with her husband Franklin for 38 years before he passed away from a heart attack on a Wednesday morning in March 5 years ago, while he was making toast in the kitchen. She had been in the garden and had come inside to find him, and the particular cruelty of that ordinary moment, the toast still in the toaster, the coffee still brewing, everything proceeding normally while Franklin was already gone, had stayed with her in the way that certain moments stay, not fading with time, but simply becoming part of the texture of everything that came after. She had 2 children. Her daughter, Vivian, was 53 and lived 20 minutes away in a newer subdivision with her husband, Carl, and their adult son, Brandon, who was 26, and still living at home in a way that Eleanor had always found slightly concerning, but had never said aloud, because it was not her household and not her business. Vivian was organized and capable, and had always been the child who appeared most competent on the surface, the one who handled things, who made arrangements, who sent the thank-you notes and remembered to schedule the car maintenance, or maintenance, and never seemed to be caught off guard by anything. Eleanor had admired this quality in her daughter for years before she began to understand that competence and kindness were not the same thing and did not always go together. Her son Dennis was 49 and lived in Atlanta with his second wife, Renee, whom Eleanor liked considerably more than she had liked Dennis's first wife, though she had never said that aloud either. Dennis was warmer than Vivian, but less reliable. The kind of person who meant everything he said in the moment he was near, got distracted by the next saying it, and then got distracted by the next thing. He called more often than Vivian but visited less, which Eleanor had come to understand was its own kind of mathematics. Affection distributed across different currencies, depending on what cost the least on any given day. The idea had come to her in September, on a Tuesday afternoon, while she was sitting in Dr. Carroll's waiting room and listening to 2 women across from her talk about a mutual friend whose children had recently placed her in a memory care facility. The women spoke in hushed, sympathetic tones about how sad it was, how the woman had not wanted to go, how her children had insisted it was for her own good. One of the women said that the daughter had power of attorney and had used it to make the decision over the mother's objections. The other woman shook her head slowly. Eleanor looked down at her crossword puzzle and felt something cold and deliberate settle in her mind, like a stone dropping into still water. She had been noticing things for several months, small things, individually unremarkable, but accumulating into a pattern that she could not ignore because ignoring patterns was not something her mind had ever allowed her to do. Vivian had started asking strange questions during their weekly dinners. Questions about whether Eleanor had paid utility bills, whether she had remembered her medication, whether she had remembered her tuition, whether she had spoken to her attorney recently about updating her documents. Dennis had called twice in August to ask, in a casual tone that was not quite casual enough, whether she had thought about what she wanted to do with the house long term. Carl, Vivian's husband, had come by uninvited one Saturday in August under the pretense of checking on a gutter that he claimed Vivian had mentioned was loose, and had spent considerable time walking through the downstairs rooms with the careful attentiveness of a man taking inventory. Eleanor was not a suspicious person by nature. She believed in extending good faith to people, especially people she loved, for as long as the evidence permitted. But she was also not a foolish person, and the evidence was beginning to say things she did not want to hear. And she had learned a long time ago that not wanting to hear something was not a good reason to stop listening. She thought about the two women in the waiting room. She thought about their friend, who had not wanted to go and had gone anyway. Hell, she thought about power of attorney and what it meant, and what it could be used for, by people whose motivations were complicated by things they would never admit out loud, not even to themselves. And then, sitting in that waiting room, with her crossword puzzle open on her lap, Eleanor Marsh had an idea. It was not a kind idea. She was aware of that from the beginning. And she sat with that awareness honestly, rather than dressing it up as something more comfortable. It was a calculated idea, a strategic idea. The kind of idea, 11 years, the kind of idea that a sharp woman arrives at when she sees that the people around her may be planning something and that the only way to know for certain what they are planning is to give them the conditions under which they will reveal it naturally. Without knowing they are being observed, she was going to pretend to be losing her memory, not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm anyone into immediate action, but gradually, the way real cognitive decline happens. In small confusions and repeated questions and moments of apparent disorientation that could be noticed and accumulated and interpreted by people who were perhaps already looking for exactly those signs. She was going to become, for a carefully managed period of time, the thing they might be preparing for. And she was going to watch, with her perfectly intact and razor-sharp mind, exactly what they did when they thought she could no longer keep track. She drove home from Dr. Carroll's office, where she had received her usual glowing report, and she sat at her kitchen table and she made a list. She was methodical about it because she was methodical about everything. She wrote down what believable early memory loss would look like, the repeated questions, some misplaced objects, the confusion about dates and times, the moments of losing a word mid-sentence, the slight disorientation in familiar places that would seem strange and worrying to people watching. She wrote down what she needed to be careful about, the crossword puzzle, which she would need to put away, and the books, which she should leave unfinished, and the conversations she would need to manage so that solutions she would need to manage did not accidentally demonstrate the very acuity she was trying to conceal. She wrote down what she hoped to find out. And then she put the list in her fireplace and burned it, because she was sharp enough to know that evidence of a plan was the one thing she could not afford. She started on a Thursday. The first test came faster than she had expected. Vivian called on Friday evening, the day after Eleanor had begun, and Eleanor, who had been preparing herself, allowed a carefully calibrated confusion to enter the conversation. When Vivian mentioned that they had discussed having dinner on Sunday, Eleanor paused for a moment longer than necessary, and then said, with just the right note of mild uncertainty, that she was not sure she remembered that. Had they talked about Sunday? She could not quite recall. Vivian's response was immediate and told Eleanor a great deal. There was no gentle reassurance, no casual "oh yes, Mom, we talked about it Tuesday." The kind of response you give when you believe the forgetting is innocent and temporary. Instead, there was a brief silence. And then Vivian's voice shifted into a register that Eleanor recognized as the voice her daughter used when she was filing information away for future reference. She said that yes, they had discussed it and that it was fine. They would confirm again tomorrow. She said it with a careful evenness that was its own kind of alarm bell ringing. Eleanor hung up the phone and sat for a moment in the particular silence of a house where only one person lives, and she felt, beneath the cold clarity of what she was doing, a sadness that she had not anticipated. She had hoped that Vivian would laugh it off. She had hoped that daughter's response would be the response of someone who was not already watching for signs, not already building a case, and that hope had lasted exactly as long as the phone call. She continued through October with methodical patience. She asked Vivian the same question twice in one conversation about what time a grandchild's school play was starting, and watched Vivian write something down. She called Dennis by Franklin's name once, just once, deliberately, in the middle of a sentence, and then corrected herself with the slightly flustered embarrassment of someone who was not sure why they had done it. And she heard Dennis go very quiet on the other end of the line. She left her purse in the living room when she went to the grocery store, something she would never have done, and mentioned it to Carl when he stopped by the following week. Saying she had been finding herself forgetting where she put things lately, it was probably nothing. Carl nodded and said yes, probably nothing, and called Vivian from the driveway before he had even reached his car. Eleanor watched him from the upstairs window, phone to his ear, speaking quickly. She understood, performing for an audience that did not know it was an audience, which was the only kind of performance that told you the truth. In November, things accelerated. Vivian began stopping by more frequently, sometimes without calling ahead, always with a reason that was not quite the real reason. A casserole she had made extra of, a plant she thought Eleanor might like. A magazine she had finished. Eleanor accepted each visit with the warm, slightly vague graciousness she had been practicing, and she watched her daughter move through the house with eyes that were taking note of things, the state of the kitchen, the mail on the counter, the medications on the windowsill. Vivian started straightening things that did not need straightening, the same way Patricia had done in Dorothy's house. And Eleanor recognized this as a particular language that adult children speak when they are building a case to themselves, gathering evidence for a conclusion they have already reached. Dennis came for Thanksgiving, which he had not done in 3 years, and he brought Renee, and they stayed for 4 days, which was also unusual. Eleanor liked having them there. She liked Renee's laugh, and the way Dennis became more himself when he was away from his Atlanta life and back in the house where he had grown up. But she was also watching. And she noticed that Dennis and Vivian disappeared into the back garden on the second day, for a conversation that lasted 40 minutes. And that when they came back inside, they were both slightly too normal in the way that people are when they have just agreed on something. Brandon, Vivian's son, came for Thanksgiving dinner and spent most of it on his phone, which was typical for Brandon. But at one point Eleanor caught him looking at her with an expression that was almost tender, which was not typical for Brandon at all, and she understood that Vivian had told him something, had briefed him in some way, and that even Brandon, who had never shown particular interest in anyone's welfare besides his own, had been recruited into whatever was being assembled around her, after dinner. When Renee was helping Eleanor in the kitchen and the others were in the living room, Renee said quietly, without looking up from the dish she was drying, that she hoped Eleanor knew she could always call her, for anything, anytime. Eleanor thanked her and meant it, because Renee was saying it the way people say things when they mean them, rather than when they are performing meaning, and Eleanor noted the difference and filed it carefully. December brought the first explicit conversation. Vivian came alone on a Saturday morning and sat at the kitchen table with the manner of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say. Which Eleanor recognized immediately because she had spent 3 months doing exactly the same thing from the opposite direction. Vivian said she wanted to talk about some things she and Dennis had been discussing. She said she was not trying to upset anyone. She said she was coming from a place of love, and Eleanor listened to this the way she had listened to everything for 3 months, with her full and undivided and perfectly functional attention, while performing just enough vagueness to keep Vivian comfortable enough to continue. Vivian said that she and Dennis had noticed some things lately that were concerning to them. She listed them carefully, the repeated questions, the name confusion, the purse at the grocery store, things that Eleanor had given her, curated and placed like breadcrumbs, and Vivian had followed every one of them to exactly the place Eleanor had suspected she might go. She talked about making sure Eleanor was safe and taken care of. She talked about a place she and Dennis had visited, a facility called Magnolia Gardens, very nice, very comfortable, wonderful staff, not far from Vivian's house. She put a brochure on the table between them. Eleanor looked at the brochure. She looked at her daughter's face, which was arranged into an expression of genuine concern that was also. Eleanor could see because she had known this face for 53 years, slightly relieved, the way a face looks when it has been working towards something for a long time and can finally see the destination approaching. she asked Vivian, in her carefully vague way, whether that was something they needed to think about right now. Vivian said, not right now, no, but soon, that it was better to have the conversation before a crisis rather than during one. Eleanor nodded slowly and said that she understood and that she trusted Vivian to help her make good decisions. She said it looking at the brochure, and she felt something move through her that was not grief exactly but was adjacent to it. The feeling of a thing you hoped would not be true being confirmed as true. After Vivian left, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called her attorney.
His name was Robert Gaines, and he had handled Eleanor and Franklin's legal affairs for 20 years, a quiet and meticulous man who wore the same style of grey suit in every season and who had the particular quality of making you feel, in his presence, that everything complicated could be managed if you were simply careful and patient and honest about what you wanted. Eleanor had always trusted him completely, not just because he was competent, which he was, but because he had known Franklin, and people who had known Franklin and thought well of him were people Eleanor trusted instinctively. She told him everything. She told him about the plan, about the 3 months of careful performance, about the brochure for Magnolia Gardens sitting on her kitchen table. She told him about what she had observed and what she had concluded and what she now wanted to do about it. Robert listened without interrupting, the way he always listened. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that she was, without question, the most strategically minded client he had encountered in 30 years of practice, and that he meant that as the highest possible compliment. They talked for 2 hours. When Eleanor left his office, she had set in motion several things that her children did not know about and would not know about until she was ready for them to know. She updated her will completely. The house, which had been split equally between Vivian and Dennis in the previous version, was now directed differently. She left Vivian a sum of money that was fair but not generous, enough to demonstrate that she had not been forgotten, not enough to suggest that everything was unchanged. She left Dennis slightly more, because Dennis had been less deliberate in what had happened, more passive, carried along by Vivian's current rather than generating his own. And she had always given weight to the difference between leading and following even when the destination was the same. The house itself she left to Renee. Not to Dennis and Renee together, to Renee specifically in her own name. She had thought about this carefully and had arrived at it not out of sentimentality but out of logic. Renee was the only person in the extended family who had sat across from her in the kitchen at Thanksgiving and said something true in a quiet voice without anyone watching. That was not nothing. That was, in Eleanor's experience, quite a lot. She also established a trust for the neighborhood community center 2 blocks from her house, the one where she had taught a free literacy class on Wednesday mornings for 11 years. A fact that none of her children had ever shown particular interest in. The trust was funded generously and was structured so that it would continue operating for 20 years after her death, regardless of what else happened with her estate. And then she planned the revelation, because a plan of this kind needed an ending, and Eleanor had always believed that endings should be chosen deliberately rather than allowed to happen to you. She invited Vivian and Dennis and their families to her house for the 2nd Saturday in January. She told Vivian it was because she had been thinking about their conversation and wanted to discuss some things. Vivian said of course, and there was a careful brightness in her voice that Eleanor recognized as the brightness of someone who believes things are going according to plan. The day before the gathering, Eleanor put her crossword puzzle back on the kitchen table. She put her current book, which she had finished 2 weeks earlier, back on the nightstand open to the last page. She made a pot of coffee and a plate of the lemon bars that Franklin had always loved, and that she still made every few weeks, because the ritual of making them was a kind of conversation with his memory that she was not ready to stop having. She was ready.
They arrived at 2 in the afternoon, Vivian and Carl and Brandon, then Dennis and Renee 20 minutes later, traffic from Atlanta having been what it always was on a Saturday. Eleanor welcomed them with the warm vagueness she had been from performing for 3 months, slightly unfocused, slightly soft around the edges. and she watched them settle into her living room with the ease of people who believe they understand the situation they are walking into. Vivian had brought a folder. Eleanor noticed it immediately, tucked under her arm. A blue folder with papers inside, and she recognized it for what it was, the kind of folder that appears when someone has done paperwork in preparation for a conversation. Carl sat close to Vivian on the couch. Brandon was on his phone, but with less absorption than usual, aware that something was happening. Renee sat in the armchair near the window and smiled at Eleanor when Eleanor brought in the lemon bars, a real smile, uncomplicated. Dennis was the one who started it, which surprised Eleanor slightly. She had expected Vivian to lead. But Dennis cleared his throat and said that they had wanted to get together because they had been thinking a lot lately about Eleanor and about what was best for her going forward. And he said it with the genuine warmth he was capable of when he was trying, though she could hear underneath it the particular strain of a man who has agreed to say something he is not entirely certain he believes. Vivian took over smoothly. Opening the folder, she had printed information about Magnolia Gardens. She had printed also what appeared to be a document about power of attorney, which Eleanor noted without letting the noting show on her face. Vivian spoke about safety and comfort, and being surrounded by people who could provide proper care. She spoke about the house being a lot of responsibility, a lot of maintenance, a lot of space for one person alone. She spoke with the organized efficiency of someone who had prepared for a difficult meeting and intended to move through the agenda. Eleanor let her finish. She let the whole thing unspool, every prepared point. Every gentle and reasonable argument, every careful reference to the things she had given them over 3 months to worry about. She sat in Franklin's old chair with her coffee cup and her face soft and her eyes slightly distant. And she let them say all of it. Then she put down her coffee cup. She reached the chair and picked up the crossword puzzle that she had left there. The one she had been doing every morning in ink for the past 3 months, and carefully hiding before any of them arrived. She put it on the table where they could all see it. Today's puzzle, completed. Every square filled in her neat, precise handwriting. She watched their eyes go to it. Then she said, in her normal voice, her actual voice, the sharp and clear and unhurried voice that was the real voice of Eleanor Marsh. That she had something she needed to tell them, and she needed them to listen carefully, because she was only going to say it once, and she wanted to make sure she was understood. She told them everything. Not with anger. Because she had decided long before this moment that anger was not the register she wanted, not because she did not feel it, but because anger would let them make the conversation about her anger rather than about what they had done. She told them in the same even, methodical way she did everything, laying out the evidence the way you lay out pieces of a puzzle, the pattern of questions, the unannounced visits, the meeting in the back garden at Thanksgiving. The brochure on the table in December, the folder Vivian had brought today with the power of attorney documents inside. She told them that she had not had a single moment of genuine memory loss in the past 3 months. Or, in the 3 years before that, or in any year she could recall, that her mind was as sharp as it had ever been, that Dr. Carroll could confirm this if anyone required confirmation. And that the crossword in front of them was completed in ink as it was every single morning of her life. The room was very quiet. Brandon had put his phone down. Carl was looking at the floor. Dennis was looking at Eleanor with an expression she could not entirely read, something between shame and relief, as if a thing he had been dreading had finally arrived and the dread had been worse than the thing itself. Vivian was looking at the folder in her lap, and Eleanor could see the slight change in her daughter's posture, the almost imperceptible deflation of someone whose plan has just dissolved. Eleanor said that she wanted to tell them what she had learned. She said that she had learned that the people you raise and love and sacrifice for are capable of being 2 things at once. Capable of loving you and also of moving towards something that serves themselves, and that these 2 things were not necessarily contradictions, but were simply the complicated truth of human beings, and that she had made her peace with that truth. She said that she did not hate any of them. She said that she was not going to pretend that the last 3 months had not happened, but she was also not going to let what had happened become the only thing between them for the rest of their lives. Because she had not come this far, through everything she had been through, to spend her remaining years in bitterness, She told them about the changes she had made to her will. She did not give them the specific details. Those were in Robert Gaines's office and would remain there. But she told them that the documents had been updated and that the updates reflected what she had observed and what she believed was fair and what she intended to stand behind regardless of any further conversations on the subject. She said this calmly and finally, the way you close a door that you have decided to close. Vivian said, quietly, that she had genuinely been worried. Eleanor looked at her daughter and said that she believed her and that worry, and the things Vivian had been planning, were not the same thing, and that she hoped Vivian could sit with the difference between those two things for a while. Dennis said he was sorry. He said it simply, without elaboration, and Eleanor accepted it simply, without elaboration, because sometimes that was how the most important things needed to be said. Renee said nothing. But she caught Eleanor's eye across the room and gave a small nod, and Eleanor nodded back, and between the two of them that was enough. In the weeks that followed, the house on the quiet street in Chattanooga was still Eleanor's. She was still doing the crossword every morning, in ink. She was still reading her 2 books a month, history and fiction, truth and imagination, the 2 things she had always believed you needed in equal measure. She still taught her Wednesday literacy class at the community center, where 3 of her current students were working toward their GED, and where a woman named Gloria had recently read aloud for the first time in her adult life and had looked up from the page with an expression that Eleanor thought she would carry in her memory for the rest of her days. Her relationship with Vivian was different now. Not broken, Eleanor had not allowed it to break, but reconfigured, rebuilt on a foundation that was more honest, if less comfortable than the one before. Vivian called every week, as she always had. But the calls were no longer inspections. They were, slowly and imperfectly, becoming conversations between 2 adults who were learning to be honest with each other in ways they had not managed before, and Eleanor thought that this, as difficult as it had been to arrive at, was more valuable than the easier relationship they had pretended to have. Dennis visited more often than he had in years. He and Renee came in February, and then again in April. And in April they worked in the garden together, the 3 of them, planting the spring bulbs that Franklin had always ordered from a catalogue in Pennsylvania every October, and that Eleanor had continued ordering every year since, because the catalogue came in October, and in October she needed things to look forward to that would arrive in April. Brandon called her, unexpectedly, on a Tuesday in March. He said he had been thinking about something she had said at the January gathering, and he wanted to ask her about it. She could not remember exactly what he had been referring to. She had said a number of things that day, but she talked with him for an hour and discovered that underneath the phone and the disengagement and the young man's self-absorption, there was a person who was paying more attention than he appeared to be. And she thought that Franklin would have liked to know that, would have found it hopeful. She was still in her house, still in her chair by the window where the afternoon light came through in a way that she had loved for 43 years. Still making Franklin's lemon bars on irregular Saturdays and talking to his memory while she measured the sugar, still sharp, still precise, still reading the world with the attention she had always given it and intended to keep giving it. She had done something calculated and not entirely kind, and she had known it from the beginning. She had looked at what was coming toward her, and she had stepped out of its path in the only way available to her. And she did not apologize for that, but she also had not let the calculating part of her be the whole of her, and that, she thought, was the balance she had always tried to strike in her life. Between the woman who protected herself and the woman who remained open to the people she loved, even after they had shown her something she had not wanted to see. On a warm evening in May, she sat on her front porch as the sun moved down toward the Tennessee hills, and she opened her crossword puzzle, and she filled in the first answer in ink, and the evening was quiet and full and entirely hers. And she thought that this was enough. This was, in fact, everything. She was still here, she was still herself, and that was not a small thing, that was the whole thing.